The war had been raging for 3 centuries, a grinding, merciless conflict that had hollowed out entire kingdoms and turned verdant valleys into graveyards of ash. The Covenant Wars, as historians would later name them, had begun not with a single declaration or betrayed alliance, but with a slow, inevitable unraveling. The ancient vampire covens and the expanding human republics could no longer share the same continent, the same night sky, the same claim to dominion over the living and the dead. What began as border skirmishes escalated into total war, a conflict so consuming that children born into it knew nothing of peace, only the distant thunder of artillery and the crimson glow on the horizon that marked another city burning. Elindra Vorsaith had been born into this war. Not merely born into its shadow, but forged within its very furnace. She was a daughter of the Vorsaith bloodline, one of the 7 great vampire houses that ruled the nocturnal dominion from their obsidian citadels in the northern wastes. Her mother had been a war matron, her father a general who'd commanded legions of thralls and lesser vampires in the great campaigns across the Ashen Marches. Elindra's childhood, if it could be called that, consisted of ballrooms that doubled as war councils, lullabies sung in ancient tongues that spoke of conquest and blood-right, and lessons in both courtly grace and battlefield savagery. By the time she reached her 50th year, barely adolescence for her kind, she could recite the genealogies of enemy houses, identify human military formations by their banner configurations, and kill a man in 17 different ways with nothing but her bare hands. But Elindra had never wanted to be a weapon. In the rare, stolen moments between training sessions and strategic briefings, she would slip away to the highest towers of Castle Vorsaith, where ancient libraries held texts predating the war. She read poetry from the Age of Twilight, when vampires and humans had coexisted in uneasy but functional peace. She studied philosophy, art, the forgotten sciences of cultivation and creation rather than destruction. Her tutors called it a waste of time. Her mother called it dangerous sentimentality. Her father simply looked disappointed, as though she were a finely crafted blade that had somehow developed a crack in its tempering. When the Dominion's War Council announced the creation of the War Bride program, Elindra knew immediately that she would be conscripted. The program was as pragmatic as it was brutal. Vampire nobility with exceptional bloodlines would be bonded to powerful military constructs, enhancing their combat abilities exponentially while also serving as living symbols of the Dominion's strength. The bonding process involved arcane rituals that fused a vampire's essence with enchanted armor and weaponry, creating warriors of terrifying power. But the process was also irreversible and often agonizing, fundamentally altering the vampire's physiology and psychology. Many who underwent the transformation emerged changed, more weapon than person, their former personalities subsumed beneath layers of combat conditioning and magical augmentation. Elindra had resisted. She'd argued, pleaded, even considered fleeing. But in the end, duty and family honor had won out, as they always did in houses like Vorsaith. She'd been bonded to the Nightfall Aegis, a suit of armor forged from shadow steel and blessed by the Dominion's most powerful blood mages. The armor was beautiful in its terrible way, elegant curves that suggested both femininity and lethality, plates that shifted like liquid darkness, and most striking of all, a pair of massive wings that unfurled from her back like a storm made manifest. The wings were not mere decoration but weapons in themselves, each feather-like blade capable of cutting through steel, each joint containing reservoirs of vampiric essence that could be channeled into devastating attacks. The transformation had taken 3 weeks. Elindra remembered fragments, pain that rewrote her understanding of suffering, visions of battles she'd never fought but somehow remembered, voices whispering in languages that predated human civilization. When she finally emerged from the ritual chamber, she was no longer simply Elindra Vorsaith. She was a war bride of the Nocturnal Dominion, a living embodiment of her house's martial pride. Her strength had increased tenfold. Her senses could detect heartbeats from hundreds of yards away. Her wings could carry her across battlefields with the speed of a hunting hawk. But something had also been taken from her, something she couldn't quite name. A lightness, perhaps, or the possibility of becoming anything other than what she now was. For 20 years, Elindra served with distinction. She led aerial assaults against human fortifications, her wings casting shadows that terrified enemy soldiers. She commanded entire battalions of lesser vampires in sweeping campaigns across contested territories. Her name became known among human military circles as the Silver Wraith, for her pale hair that streamed behind her in flight and the ghostly silence with which she struck. She accumulated victories and commendations, blood oaths of loyalty from subordinates, and the grudging respect of even the most traditionalist vampire commanders. But with each battle she felt herself hollowing out, becoming more the weapon her family had always wanted and less the person she'd once hoped to be. The Battle of Thornwick Junction changed everything. It was meant to be a decisive engagement. Human forces had established a massive supply depot and forward operating base in the ruins of an ancient city, and the Dominion's high command ordered its destruction. Elindra led the initial assault, her wings carrying her ahead of the main force as she dove toward the human defensive lines. The night was perfect for vampires, moonless with thick cloud cover that swallowed light and sound. But the humans had been preparing. As Elindra swept low to engage the outer fortifications, the sky erupted with artificial daylight. The humans had developed dawn flares, weapons that burned with concentrated solar essence captured and weaponized through some terrible alchemy. The light didn't kill vampires outright, but it weakened them catastrophically, burning exposed skin and disrupting the magical enhancements that made war brides so formidable. Elindra felt her strength drain away as though someone had opened her veins. Her wings seized, muscles spasming as the solar essence coursed through her nervous system. She plummeted from the sky like a shot bird, crashing through the roof of a ruined building and finally slamming into the stone-littered earth of what had once been a city square. The pain was immediate and total. She'd broken bones before, ribs, fingers, once even her jaw, and vampiric healing had always knitted them back together within hours. But this was different. As she tried to rise, to call upon the supernatural strength that had defined her for 2 decades, nothing responded. Her legs couldn't move. She dragged herself forward with her arms, leaving a trail of dark blood on the ash-covered ground, but her lower body remained stubbornly, horrifyingly inert. The Nightfall Aegis, which had always felt like an extension of her own body, now hung on her like a prison. Her wings were splayed uselessly across the ground, beautiful and broken. Around her the battle raged. She could hear the sounds, gunfire and screaming, the thunderous detonations of artillery, the shrieking battle cries of her fellow vampires as they engaged the human forces. But those sounds were growing distant, the battle line moving away from her position as the Dominion forces retreated in disarray. The dawn flares had broken the assault's momentum, and now her people were falling back to regroup. Elindra tried to call out to signal for extraction, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and thick, mixing with the ash and dirt. Hours passed. Or perhaps only minutes. Time had become strange and elastic, marked only by the gradual fading of distant sounds. The battle moved on. The fires burned themselves out. Twilight came, painting the ruined city in shades of ember and shadow. Elindra lay where she'd fallen, her body still refusing to obey, her mind cycling through shock and anger and a cold, creeping understanding. She'd been left behind. Not out of malice, perhaps, but out of necessity. In war you didn't risk additional casualties to recover the fallen, especially when retreat was the only option. She was alone on a battlefield deep in enemy territory, paralyzed and bleeding, with human patrols certainly sweeping the area for survivors. The practical part of her mind, the part shaped by military training, understood that death was coming. Human soldiers would find her eventually. They might interrogate her first if they recognized her rank, but ultimately they would execute her. That was simply how war worked. The vampires did the same to captured human officers. There was a brutal logic to it, a mathematics of survival that left no room for mercy. Elindra found herself almost accepting this fate. She was so tired after all, tired of war, tired of being a weapon, tired of carrying the weight of her family's expectations and her own compromised ideals. Perhaps death would be a form of freedom, a release from the contradictions that had defined her existence. But a smaller part of her, the part that had once read poetry in high towers and imagined different futures, rebelled against that resignation. She didn't want to die here, anonymous and alone, just another casualty in a war that had already consumed so much. She wanted, needed, Something else, though she couldn't quite articulate what that might be. So she waited, her red eyes scanning the darkening ruins, her broken wings trembling with each shallow breath, as twilight deepened toward night and the ash continued to drift down like toxic snow. Sergeant Marcus Aldrich had stopped counting the days since his enlistment somewhere around the 600 mark. Time had a way of losing meaning in war, especially wars like this one, conflicts so long-running that they became less like events and more like permanent conditions, the way mountains or oceans were permanent. He joined the Republican Guard at 19, motivated by a mixture of patriotism, economic necessity, and the naive belief that he might somehow make a difference. 15 years later, he was still alive, which made him either very skilled or very lucky, and he'd long ago stopped believing in differences worth making. Wars didn't end, they just exhausted themselves temporarily before finding new reasons to resume. Marcus had seen horrors enough to populate a dozen lifetimes of nightmares. He'd watched friends die in dozens of different ways, quick deaths from vampire assassins who struck like shadows, slow deaths from infected wounds in field hospitals with insufficient supplies, stupid deaths from artillery and friendly fire and simple bad luck. He'd killed too, more than he could count or wanted to remember, his rifle becoming an extension of his will in the same way a vampire's fangs were extensions of their hunger. After enough years, enough battles, enough loss, a soldier either broke completely or developed a kind of functional numbness, a way of existing that allowed you to continue operating without feeling the full weight of what you'd done and witnessed. But Marcus had managed to hold on to something that many of his fellow soldiers lost, a kernel of humanity that refused to be ground down by the war's machinery. He couldn't explain exactly why or how. Perhaps it was his upbringing in a farming community where people still helped neighbors without expecting payment, or maybe it was simply stubbornness, an irrational refusal to let the war define him completely. Whatever the reason, Marcus still felt things when many around him had become hollow. He still mourned fallen comrades. He still helped civilian refugees when he could. He still sometimes lay awake wondering if there might be some way to end the killing, even though logic and experience told him such thoughts were pointless. The Battle of Thornwick Junction had been intense even by the standards Marcus had grown accustomed to. The dawn flares had worked spectacularly, breaking the vampire assault and sending the Dominion forces into disorganized retreat. But the cost had been high, hundreds of human casualties, entire sections of the defensive perimeter collapsed or burning, and now the aftermath, the grim work of sweeping the battlefield for wounded, identifying the dead, securing equipment, and ensuring no enemy forces remained hidden in the ruins. Marcus's squad had been assigned to the eastern sector, a maze of collapsed buildings and rubble-choked streets where the initial vampire assault had hit hardest. They'd been sweeping for 3 hours when Marcus spotted the blood trail. It was dark, almost black in the fading light, leading from a collapsed building into what appeared to be an old plaza. His squad leader, Lieutenant Vance, waved for the team to fan out and approach cautiously. Standard procedure. Injured vampires were often more dangerous than healthy ones, pain and desperation making them unpredictable. Marcus moved forward with his rifle raised, scanning for threats, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The blood trail led to a figure sprawled among the ash and debris, and as Marcus got closer, his breath caught in his throat. He'd seen vampires before, of course. You couldn't fight a 15-year war without encountering the enemy up close. But this was different. The vampire before him was clearly high-ranking, wearing armor that was both elegant and terrifying, crafted from materials that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Her wings were the most striking feature. Massive, stretching out across the ground, each feather-like blade catching the dying light. She was clearly female, pale as marble, with silver-white hair that had come loose from whatever style it had been arranged in, now tangled with blood and dirt. Her red eyes tracked Marcus's approach with an expression that was equal parts defiant and terrified. "Contact," Vance called out as the rest of the squad moved up. "High-value target. Someone get command on comms, we've got what looks like a war bride here." Marcus kept his rifle trained on the vampire, but something felt wrong. She wasn't moving aggressively, wasn't trying to attack or flee. In fact, as he watched, he realized she was barely moving at all. Her arms shifted slightly, but her legs remained completely still, and her wings trembled but didn't lift. The pool of blood beneath her had spread wide, soaking into the ash-covered ground. She was injured badly, possibly paralyzed. "Please," the vampire said, her voice barely audible, speaking in accented but clear human language. "Please just make it quick." The words hit Marcus harder than they should have. There was no bravado in them, no warrior's defiance. Just exhaustion and pain and a terrible, resigned acceptance. He'd heard similar words before, from wounded soldiers who knew they were dying and just wanted the suffering to end. But hearing them from a vampire, from an enemy who was supposed to be some kind of inhuman monster, created a cognitive dissonance that Marcus couldn't immediately reconcile. "Check her for weapons," Vance ordered, and 2 soldiers moved forward, keeping their rifles trained on the vampire while they patted down her armor. They found several blades concealed in her armor's joints, a small vial of something that was probably blood or poison, but nothing she could realistically reach or use in her current state. "She's clean. Mostly. Can't reach anything even if she wanted to." Vance moved closer, studying the vampire with the cold assessment of someone evaluating a potentially valuable asset. "You're a long way from friendly territory, bloodsucker. Your people left you behind." The vampire, Elindra, Marcus would learn later, closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was something defeated in her expression that Marcus recognized from a mirror he tried to avoid looking into. "Yes, the retreat. I can't move my legs. They left me." "Smart of them," Vance said without sympathy. "You're probably worth a significant intelligence haul. Command's going to want to interrogate you thoroughly before deciding what to do with you." He turned to the squad. "We need a stretcher and—" "Sir," Marcus interrupted, surprising himself. "Permission to speak?" Vance looked at him with poorly concealed irritation. "Make it quick, Aldrich." Marcus wasn't entirely sure what he was about to say until the words started coming out. "She's dying, sir. That much blood loss, the paralysis, even with vampire healing she might not survive transport back to base, especially not if we wait for a stretcher team. And if we're being honest, Command's going to spend hours, maybe days interrogating her before," he trailed off, not wanting to say what they all knew came next. "Your point, Sergeant?" "My point is that we're standing here deciding how to most efficiently process a dying enemy when we could just not." Marcus knew he was crossing a line, could see it in Vance's expression, but something made him continue. "The war's going to be here tomorrow regardless of what we do with one paralyzed vampire. We could just leave her. She's not a threat, she can't report our positions or tactics. She's already been left behind by her own people. We could just let it go." The silence that followed was tense and uncomfortable. The other soldiers looked between Marcus and Vance, unsure how this would resolve. Vance's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "That's the second time you've questioned my judgment today, Aldrich. You think because you've survived this long that gives you the right to develop a conscience? This is a war bride. Her kind has killed hundreds of our people. Thousands. She's a legitimate military target and intelligence asset. She's also helpless and abandoned," Marcus countered, his own voice hardening. "And if we torture information out of her and then execute her, how exactly does that make us different from them? We're not the ones who started this war. No, sir, we're just the ones who keep finding reasons to continue it." For a long moment, Marcus thought Vance might actually strike him or relieve him of duty on the spot. The lieutenant's face had gone red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But then something shifted in his expression, not agreement exactly, but a weary recognition of an argument he didn't have the energy to win. "Fine," Vance said finally. "You want to throw away a strategic asset because of some misplaced mercy? Your career, your call. But you don't get to make that decision for the squad." He turned to address the other soldiers. "Anyone who wants to report this to command, speak now. We found a high-value enemy target, and regulations say we should extract her for intelligence purposes." No one spoke. The soldiers looked at each other, then at the vampire lying broken in the ash, then back at Vance. "No? Nothing?" Vance shook his head in disgust. "You're all compromised. Too long in the field, too much empathy for things that would drink your blood without a second thought. But fine. We leave her. And if command asks, when they ask, We swept this sector and found nothing but corpses and equipment. He walked away without waiting for acknowledgement, and after a moment the rest of the squad followed. All except Marcus, who remained standing over the vampire, his rifle lowered but not holstered. Elindra looked up at him with an expression that was difficult to read, confusion, certainly, and suspicion, but also something that might have been gratitude or perhaps just shock. "Why?" she asked simply. Marcus wasn't sure he had a good answer. "Because I'm tired of killing," he said finally. "Because this war has taken enough from both sides. Because you asked me to make it quick, and something about that made me realize that if I pulled that trigger, I'd be killing a person, not just an enemy. Choose whichever reason works for you." He started to turn away, to follow his squad and leave her to whatever fate awaited a paralyzed vampire alone on a battlefield. But then he stopped, some impulse making him reconsider. The rational part of his mind screamed that he was being an idiot, that he'd already pushed his luck far enough, that getting further involved would only complicate an already dangerous situation. But the part of him that had somehow maintained its humanity through 15 years of war had a different opinion. Marcus turned back and knelt beside Elindra, setting his rifle aside but keeping his sidearm within easy reach. "How bad is it?" "The paralysis." Elindra's eyes widened slightly at his return. I don't know. The dawn flare, the fall, something damaged my spine or the neural bonding with my armor. I can feel my legs but I can't move them. Can't access most of my combat abilities. Even my wings won't respond properly. And the bleeding? Slowing down. We heal faster than humans, but it's not instantaneous, especially with this kind of trauma. She studied him warily. Why are you still here? Your commander said you could leave. He did, Marcus agreed. But I've spent 15 years following orders and making the smart, tactical decisions. Maybe just this once, I want to make a different choice. He looked at her properly now, not as a target or enemy but as a person. Past the armor and wings, past the vampiric pallor and predatory features, he saw exhaustion and pain and a vulnerability that was almost shocking in its intensity. I don't think you deserve to die alone in the ash. Not like this. I'm your enemy, Elindra said, but there was less conviction in it than seemed warranted. Yeah, Marcus acknowledged. And tomorrow I'll probably go back to shooting at your people and you'll probably go back to wanting me dead. But right now, tonight, you're just someone who's hurt and scared and abandoned. And I'm someone who can help if you'll let me. Help me how? Carry me back to my lines? You'd be killed on sight. No, Marcus said, thinking quickly. But there's an old medical outpost about 2 miles from here, abandoned years ago when the front lines shifted. It's not much, probably structurally unsound, definitely unsanitary, but it has walls and a roof, and it's away from patrol routes. I could get you there at least. Give you a chance to recover enough to figure out your next move. Elindra stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of trap or trick. Marcus understood her suspicion. In her position, he'd be suspicious too. Finally, she gave a slight nod. Why not? Dying in an abandoned outpost seems marginally better than dying in an ash field. That's the spirit, Marcus said dryly. He moved around behind her, assessing the best way to lift her without causing additional injury. Her armor was lighter than it looked, but she was still tall and the wings added significant complexity. This is going to hurt. I apologize in advance. I've survived worse, Elindra said, though her voice was tight with apprehension. Marcus slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees, bracing himself before lifting. Elindra gasped and he felt her body go rigid with pain, but she didn't cry out. Her wings draped over his arms like a heavy cloak, and he had to adjust his grip several times to find a position that wouldn't cause them both to topple over. Finally balanced, Marcus began walking, carrying the paralyzed war bride away from the battlefield, into the deepening twilight, toward an uncertain destination and an even more uncertain future. The ash continued to fall around them like gray snow, coating them both in its fine powder as Marcus navigated through the ruins. Neither spoke, but the silence wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Elindra's head rested against Marcus's chest, her red eyes half closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Marcus focused on his footing, on the weight in his arms, on the strange unreality of the situation he'd voluntarily entered. He'd saved an enemy, hidden a strategic asset from his own command, potentially compromised his military career and personal safety for someone who, by all rights, should have been his kill or his prisoner. But as he walked, carrying his burden through the devastated landscape, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense that he'd done something genuinely right, something that existed outside the brutal calculus of war. For 15 years he'd been part of a machine designed to kill and destroy. Tonight, for these few hours, he was something else. He was someone who'd chosen mercy over tactics, humanity over orders, compassion over the easy answer. Whether that made him a fool or a hero, he didn't know and wasn't sure he cared. It simply was, and for now that was enough. The medical outpost had been built during the war's early years when the front lines had been stable enough to maintain permanent facilities. It was a squat, concrete structure half buried in the hillside for protection, designed to handle battlefield casualties before they could be transported to proper hospitals. But warfare was fluid, and the lines had shifted south, then north, then south again, and at some point, the outpost had simply been abandoned, too remote to be worth garrisoning, too damaged to be worth repairing, too insignificant to warrant destruction. Now it stood empty and forgotten, nature and weather slowly reclaiming it, another ruin in a landscape filled with ruins. Marcus had discovered it 6 months ago during a long-range patrol, filed its location away mentally as the kind of thing that might be useful someday. He'd never imagined useful would mean sheltering an enemy vampire, but life in wartime had taught him to expect the unexpected. The walk took nearly 3 hours. Marcus had to move slowly, both to avoid detection and to prevent jostling Elindra's injuries more than necessary. She'd fallen into a kind of stupor after the first hour, not unconscious but not fully present either, her breathing shallow and her body unnaturally still in his arms. By the time they reached the outpost, full night had fallen. The structure was even more decrepit than Marcus remembered. One wall had partially collapsed, vegetation had grown through cracks in the foundation, and the interior was thick with dust and the smell of decay. But it had a roof mostly intact, and more importantly, it was hidden in a small ravine that made it nearly invisible from any standard patrol route. Marcus maneuvered carefully through the collapsed doorway, his night vision scope pushed up on his helmet as he let his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness inside. The main treatment room was still marginally intact. Rusted medical equipment lay scattered on the floor and ancient bloodstains darkened the concrete, but there were surfaces that could serve as a bed if cleared of debris. Marcus gently lowered Elindra onto a relatively clean section of counter that had once been used for preparing instruments. She stirred as he set her down, her eyes opening to take in their surroundings. "Charming," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "You bring all your enemies to such romantic locations?" Despite everything, Marcus found himself almost smiling. "Only the special ones. Try not to move too much. I need to assess your injuries properly, and I don't have much in the way of medical supplies. Don't suppose you have any blood?" Elindra asked, and there was a dark humor in it but also genuine need. "We heal faster with blood. Without it, my natural regeneration is slow." Marcus had anticipated this. "I don't have stored blood, but I have the next best thing." He pulled out his combat knife and began rolling up his sleeve before he could think better of it. "Wait," Elindra said quickly. "You're offering to let me feed from you? Directly?" "Unless you've got a better suggestion," Marcus replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You need blood to heal." "I have blood." The math seems straightforward. Elindra shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. Feeding creates bonds, neural connections. For your kind, it can be addictive, and for mine, it establishes links that are difficult to sever. You'd be giving me access to your thoughts, potentially your memories, and there's always the risk I couldn't control myself, that I'd take too much." Marcus considered this, the knife still poised against his wrist. "Could you control yourself? If I let you feed?" Yes, I think so. I'm trained for control. But I've never fed directly from a human before. War brides subsist on stored blood provided by the Dominion. What you're offering is," she struggled for words, "intimate, dangerous, complicated." "Well, we've already established I'm good at making complicated decisions," Marcus said. He pressed the blade against his wrist, not quite cutting yet. "And if it helps you heal, if it means you have a chance at surviving this, then it's worth the risk. Unless you have moral objections to drinking human blood. A bitter laugh escaped Elindra. Moral objections. That's rich, coming from someone whose people have spent 3 centuries trying to exterminate mine. But her gaze fixed on his wrist with an intensity that was part hunger, part fascination. If you're serious, I won't stop you. But understand what you're offering. This isn't like giving blood at a hospital. This is different. Marcus drew the blade across his wrist in a quick, clean motion. Blood welled up immediately, dark and vital. He moved closer to Elindra, holding his arm out to her. Then let it be different. I'm done with the same old patterns anyway. Elindra hesitated for only a moment longer before her instincts overwhelmed her reservations. She grasped his arm with surprising gentleness given her desperation, guiding his wrist to her mouth. When her lips closed over the wound, Marcus felt a sharp, cold sensation that quickly transformed into something stranger. Not pain exactly, but an awareness of connection, of something flowing from him to her that was more than just physical blood. Her eyes closed as she drank, and Marcus could see her wings trembling, color returning slowly to her too pale skin. The sensation was indeed unlike anything Marcus had experienced. There was an intimacy to it that transcended the physical act, as though she were reading him through his blood, learning his essence through taste and biology. He could almost feel her presence in his mind, not thoughts exactly but impressions, emotions flickering at the edge of his consciousness. Determination. Pain. Loneliness. Hunger not just for blood but for connection, for purpose, for something beyond the grinding machinery of war. Were these her feelings or his own projected onto her? Marcus couldn't tell, and the ambiguity was both unsettling and strangely compelling. After what felt like both seconds and hours, Elindra pulled away. Blood stained her lips, but her eyes were clearer, more focused than before. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That was more than I expected. More than I deserved." Marcus pulled his wrist back, examining the wound. It was already clotting, and though he felt lightheaded, it wasn't debilitating. Did it help? Yes. I can feel the healing accelerating. It will still take time. My spine, the neural damage, those are complex injuries even for us. But with your blood, I have a chance. She studied him with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. I felt your memories when I drank. Glimpses of them anyway. You've lost people. Friends. Someone you loved. Marcus stiffened slightly. That's not your concern. No, Elindra agreed. But it explains some things. Why you helped me. You know what it's like to be left behind. When Marcus didn't respond, she continued. I saw farmland. A place with green fields and clear skies. Before the war consumed it. A long time ago, Marcus said curtly. He didn't want to talk about the life he'd had before, the family farm that no longer existed, the brother who died in the war's opening years, the future that had been stolen before he'd been old enough to even understand what he was losing. We should focus on keeping you alive through the night. Your people have healing techniques beyond what I know. If you can guide me, I'll do what I can to help. Elindra nodded, accepting the change of subject. The armor. It needs to come off. It's bonded to me, part of my physiology, but in my current state, it's more hindrance than help. The weight is compressing my injuries. How do I remove it without hurting you? There are releases, Elindra explained, indicating various points on her armor. Here, and along the spine. But you need to understand, the armor is more than just metal. It's alive in its own way, connected to my essence. Removing it will be painful for me and it might react. Try to protect me by attacking you. Of course it might, Marcus muttered. But he moved to the indicated release points, studying the mechanisms. They were unlike any human armor he'd encountered. Less mechanical and more organic, as though the metal had been grown rather than forged. He found the first release, a subtle indentation near her shoulder, and pressed firmly. The armor responded immediately, plates beginning to separate with a sound like sighing wind. Elindra gasped, and Marcus felt her body go rigid. Keep going, she managed through clenched teeth. Don't stop halfway. Marcus worked methodically, finding each release point and activating it. The armor came apart in sections, revealing the extent of her injuries beneath. Her skin was covered in bruises that looked like ink stains, and along her spine, there was a region that was almost black, the flesh damaged so severely that it seemed partially necrotic. Her wings were the worst. The points where they attached to her back were torn and bleeding, the delicate structures that allowed her to fly clearly damaged beyond her body's immediate ability to repair. "I need to clean these wounds," Marcus said, forcing himself into the clinical mindset he'd learned during combat medical training. "It's going to hurt." "Everything hurts," Elindra replied. "What's a little more?" Marcus used water from his canteen and scraps of relatively clean cloth from his pack to clean the injuries as best he could. Elindra bore it silently, but he could see tears streaming down her face, glowing faintly red in the darkness. As he worked, Marcus found himself talking, perhaps to distract both of them from the grim task. "You said you'd never fed from a human before. How does that work? In the Dominion, you're vampires. Where do you get blood if not from humans?" "We farm it," Elindra said, her voice strained but steady. "Blood cultivation from willing donors, mostly lower caste vampires and thralls who provide in exchange for protection and status. It's less potent than fresh human blood, but it's sustainable. The Dominion isn't the mindless horde of monsters your propaganda portrays. We have society, laws, culture. We're not all warriors and assassins." "Then why the war?" Marcus asked. "If you've got systems, civilization, why not just coexist?" "The same reason your republics won't coexist with us," Elindra replied. "Fear. Resource competition. Historical grievances that have calcified into hatred. And because there are powers on both sides that benefit from continued conflict." She winced as Marcus cleaned a particularly deep wound. "I didn't want this war. My family, my house, they're traditionalists. Military nobility who see war as the highest calling. But I used to read poetry, study philosophy. I wanted to understand the world, not conquer it." Marcus paused in his work, looking at her with new perspective. "Used to. War doesn't leave much room for philosophy," Elindra said bitterly. "When they made me a war bride, they took the choice away. I became a weapon because that's what my bloodline required, what the Dominion needed. 20 years I've fought in this war. 20 years I've killed your people, burned your cities, followed orders I didn't believe in because that's what duty demanded. And now look at me, broken on a battlefield, saved by an enemy, my own forces leaving me behind because a paralyzed war bride is a liability they can't afford." "Sounds familiar," Marcus said quietly. He finished cleaning the last visible wound and sat back, exhausting. "I enlisted believing I'd make a difference. That I'd protect people, preserve something worth preserving. 15 years later, I'm just another cog in a war machine, following orders, killing enemies I've never spoken to until tonight. We're not so different, you and I." "That's a dangerous thing to realize," Elindra observed. "Makes it harder to keep fighting." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Marcus countered. He looked around the ruined outpost, at the decay and destruction that symbolized the war's cost. "Maybe if more people on both sides realized we're not so different, this whole thing would collapse under the weight of its own pointlessness." "You're an idealist." "I'm a tired soldier who's seen too much death and wants to believe there's some alternative," Marcus corrected. "Is that idealism or just survival instinct?" Elindra was quiet for a moment. "When I drank your blood, I felt something else. Beyond the memories. You have hope. Somehow, after everything you've experienced, you still believe things can be better." "How?" Marcus didn't have a good answer. "Stubbornness? Stupidity? Maybe I'm just too dumb to accept that this is all there is." He met her red eyes directly. "Or maybe hope is the only weapon we have left that the war hasn't taken from us." The night deepened around them, and gradually the adrenaline that had sustained Marcus began to fade, leaving him exhausted to his bones. Elindra was healing, slowly but visibly, the worst of her wounds beginning to close, color returning to her features. But she was also clearly drained, the combination of injury, paralysis, and the armor's removal taking a profound toll. They fell into a companionable silence, two enemies turned unlikely allies, sheltering together in a forgotten ruin while the war continued somewhere beyond their small refuge. Marcus dozed fitfully, his rifle always within reach, his military training never quite letting him fully relax even in his exhaustion. Elindra remained motionless, her legs still paralyzed, her wings draped over the edge of the counter like fallen banners. But her eyes remained open, watching the darkness, perhaps thinking about poetry and philosophy and futures that the war had made impossible. Or perhaps just trying to understand how she'd ended up here, saved by an enemy, dependent on the mercy of someone she'd been trained to kill without hesitation. Dawn was still hours away when Marcus jerked fully awake, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Elindra's eyes had closed at some point, but she opened them now, alert despite her injuries. "You heard it too?" she asked quietly. Marcus nodded. Voices outside. Distant but approaching. Human voices, speaking in the clipped tones of military communication. A patrol, sweeping the area, following some route that had brought them near the forgotten outpost. Marcus cursed silently. They'd been careful, left minimal trail, but if the patrol decided to investigate the structure, there was no way to hide Elindra effectively. "You need to leave," Elindra said urgently. "If they find you here with me, you'll be executed for treason." "They find you alone, you'll be executed anyway," Marcus countered. "Or worse." "I'm dead regardless," Elindra said with brutal honesty. "But you don't have to die with me. Go. Rejoin your unit. Tell them you got separated during the sweep. You've bought me hours I wouldn't have had otherwise. That's enough." Marcus looked at her, this vampire warrior who'd been abandoned by her own people, who'd once read poetry and dreamed of something beyond war, who was even now more concerned about his survival than her own. And he made another decision that defied logic, tactics, and self-preservation. "No," he said simply. "We do this together or not at all." "You're insane." "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But I'm also committed now. So here's what we're going to do." The patrol consisted of 6 soldiers, moving in a standard sweep formation, their conversation suggesting this was routine rather than targeted. Marcus waited until they were close enough, then stepped out of the outpost with his hands visibly empty of weapons, his posture non-threatening but alert. The soldiers reacted instantly, rifles snapping up to cover him, voices demanding identification. "Sergeant Marcus Aldrich, Republican Guard, 3rd Battalion," Marcus called out clearly. "I got separated from my unit during the Thornwick Junction sweep. I've been holed up here waiting for daylight to navigate back to friendly lines." The patrol leader, a corporal whose nameplate read, Chin, approached cautiously. "Separated how, Sergeant? And why here specifically?" "Got turned around in the ruins during the vampire retreat," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady, reciting the lie he'd prepared. "Took fire from a retreating group, pursued into unfamiliar territory, lost my bearings. Found this structure and decided to wait rather than wander and risk friendly fire. It was plausible enough. Battles were chaotic and soldiers getting separated wasn't unusual." Chin studied him skeptically. "You've been here all night? Alone?" "It's been a long night," Marcus said. "But yeah, alone." "Mind if we verify that?" Chin asked, but it wasn't really a question. He signaled to 2 of his squad members, who moved toward the outpost entrance. Marcus felt his heart rate spike but kept his expression neutral. If they found Elindra, this ended badly for everyone. But before the soldiers reached the entrance, an explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence. It was distant but unmistakable, a large detonation somewhere to the south, followed by the rapid crackle of automatic weapons fire. Chen's radio erupted with urgent voices, reports of a Dominion counterattack hitting one of the forward outposts, all available units being recalled to reinforce the defensive line. "Shit," Chen muttered. He looked at Marcus, clearly torn between investigating the outpost and responding to the emergency. Military necessity won out, as Marcus had gambled it would. "Sergeant, you're with us. We're moving to reinforce Firebase Echo. You can reunite with your unit later." "Understood, Corporal," Marcus said, though internally he was calculating. The counterattack would pull units away from this area, might give him opportunity to return to Elindra before the situation collapsed entirely. But it also meant diving back into combat, back into the war's machinery, after a night spent questioning everything that machinery represented. As the patrol moved out at a fast jog toward the sounds of battle, Marcus glanced back once at the outpost. He couldn't see Elindra from this distance, couldn't know if she'd heard the exchange or understood that he'd just lied to his own people to protect her. But he'd made his choice and now he had to live with the consequences. The battle at Firebase Echo was intense but brief. A probing attack rather than an all-out assault, designed to test human defenses and gather intelligence. Marcus fought mechanically, his training taking over while his mind remained partially elsewhere, wondering if Elindra was still alive, if she was healing, if he'd just wasted his effort and compromised his integrity for nothing. When the Dominion forces finally withdrew with the coming dawn, Marcus was exhausted, blood-spattered, and more confused about his own motivations than ever. But he was also still alive. And when Chen's squad was finally released from duty as reinforcements arrived from other sectors, Marcus made his excuses and slipped away in the chaos of soldiers being reorganized and debriefed. He navigated back toward the outpost through the growing daylight, now truly at risk. A human soldier alone in contested territory, tired and low on ammunition, moving toward an enemy vampire who might already be dead or might kill him the moment he returned. The sun was fully up when Marcus finally reached the outpost. He approached cautiously, unsure what he'd find. The interior was silent, and for a terrible moment he thought Elindra might have died during the night, her injuries proving too severe even for vampiric healing. But then he saw movement, subtle, just the shift of shadow, and found her still on the counter where he'd left her, though she'd managed to pull herself into a slightly more upright position. "You came back," Elindra said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. "I said we do this together," Marcus replied. "I meant it. The battle. I heard it. You fought." "I did what I had to do to survive and maintain my cover," Marcus said. "Which is technically true from multiple perspectives." He moved closer, checking her condition. She looked better than she had the night before. Her wounds had closed further and there was more vitality in her features, but her legs still lay motionless. "Can you feel your legs yet?" Marcus asked. Elindra shook her head. "Sensation but no control. The neural pathways are damaged severely. It might take weeks to heal naturally, and that's assuming I survive that long." She looked at him intently. "You need to leave. Properly this time. Every moment you spend here risks your life and career. You've done more than enough." "What will you do?" Marcus asked instead of addressing her suggestion. "Survive as long as I can," Elindra said with grim determination. "Maybe I'll heal enough to crawl somewhere safer. Maybe Dominion patrols will find me eventually. Maybe I'll just fade away in this ruin. But that's not your concern anymore." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his options. He could leave as she suggested. Return to his unit, resume his life as a soldier, pretend this interlude had never happened. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But as he looked at Elindra, at this enemy who'd become something more than an enemy in the space of a single night, he realized he'd crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the war, of himself, of what mattered. "I have another idea," Marcus said slowly. "It's risky, probably stupid, and definitely not standard procedure. But then again, nothing about this situation has been standard." "I'm listening," Elindra said warily. "There's a neutral zone," Marcus explained. "Or as neutral as anything gets in this war. About 40 miles southeast of here, there's a region that both sides have tacitly agreed not to contest. It's harsh terrain, low strategic value, but it has settlements, deserters, refugees, people who've opted out of the war entirely. They're tolerated by both sides because they're useful. They serve as informal intermediaries, trade goods, provide intelligence to both factions. It's a gray area in every sense." "You're suggesting we go there?" Elindra asked. "A paralyzed vampire and a human soldier, deserting to a lawless neutral zone? When you put it that way, it sounds even worse than I thought," Marcus admitted. "But yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. We can't stay here, it's too exposed. You can't return to your people in your condition, and I can't return to mine knowing what I've done. But in the neutral zone we might have a chance. You could heal properly and I could figure out what comes next. You'd be a deserter. If you're caught, they'll execute you. And you'd be a failed war bride who survived when she should have died. I doubt your commanders would welcome you back with open arms, paralyzed or not." Marcus held her gaze. "We're both compromised now. Might as well be compromised somewhere that doesn't involve constant risk of death." Elindra was silent for a long time, clearly weighing the proposal against her own expectations and training. Finally she spoke. The Dominion doesn't tolerate desertion. If my house learns I fled to neutral territory rather than dying honorably, it will destroy their reputation. They'll send assassins. Then we'll deal with assassins, Marcus said. Together. Look, I'm not saying this is a perfect plan or even a good one. But it's better than the alternatives I can see. And maybe it's a chance for both of us to be something other than soldiers for once. To be what? I don't know, Marcus admitted. People maybe? Individuals with choices that aren't determined by military hierarchies and ancient grudges? It's been so long I'm not sure I remember what that looks like. But I'd like to find out. Elindra studied him for a long moment, her red eyes searching his face as though trying to read his intentions at a cellular level. You're serious? You'd actually throw away your entire life for this? For me? Not just for you, Marcus corrected. For myself too. Because I realized last night that I've been dying slowly for 15 years, piece by piece, battle by battle. And carrying you away from that battlefield was the first time in years I felt alive in a way that mattered. So yes, I'm serious. Probably crazy, but serious. A slow, unexpected smile crossed Elindra's features. Crazy is an improvement over the alternatives I was facing. All right, human. If you're determined to doom us both to an uncertain future in a neutral zone surrounded by outlaws and refugees, who am I to argue? Though I should warn you, I'm terrible company when I'm healing. I've spent 15 years with soldiers, Marcus replied dryly. I doubt you're worse company than a barracks full of infantry. You'd be surprised, Elindra said, but there was warmth in it now, a hint of something that might have been hope or at least the absence of despair. So, how exactly do you propose we travel 40 miles with me unable to walk? Very slowly and uncomfortably, Marcus admitted. I'll need to construct some kind of travois or sled. Use materials from this outpost and whatever I can scavenge. It'll take a couple days probably, both to build it and to make the journey. We'll have to move at night to avoid detection, rest during the day. It's going to be hard on both of us. I've endured worse, Elindra said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Then we have a plan, Marcus said. Terrible, dangerous, and likely to get us both killed or worse. But a plan nonetheless. He set to work immediately, using his combat knife and tools from his field kit to begin disassembling parts of the outpost that could be repurposed. Elindra watched from her perch on the counter, occasionally offering suggestions or warnings about her wings and armor requirements. As Marcus worked, they talked, carefully at first, then with increasing openness, sharing pieces of their lives that the war had tried to erase. Marcus learned that Elindra had a younger sister still in the Dominion, a scholar who'd been spared the war bride program due to poor health. Elindra hadn't seen her in 12 years but still cherished memories of their childhood, before duty and destiny had separated them. Elindra learned that Marcus had wanted to be a teacher before the war, had planned to study literature and history, dreams that had been abandoned when his family farm was destroyed and military service became the only viable path to survival. They discovered shared interests. Both enjoyed classical music, though their culture's definitions of classical were radically different. Both had read extensively despite their military careers, finding solace in books during rare quiet moments. Both harbored doubts about their respective societies' narratives of the war, questions they'd never dared voice to comrades who wouldn't understand. By the second night, Marcus had constructed a rough but functional travois, using metal poles from surgical equipment and fabric from old medical supplies. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would allow him to drag Elindra while distributing her weight more evenly than carrying her. He'd also salvaged additional medical supplies, water purification tablets, and even some preserved rations that were barely edible but still technically nutritious. Ready? Marcus asked as twilight descended on their third night in the outpost. Elindra nodded, though Marcus could see tension in her features. As ready as I'll ever be. Though I should warn you, if we encounter Dominion forces they'll recognize me. And they won't hesitate to kill us both. Same goes for human patrols, Marcus acknowledged. But we've made it this far on impossible odds. Maybe we can stretch that luck a little further. He helped Elindra onto the travois, carefully arranging her paralyzed legs and damaged wings to minimize discomfort. She hissed in pain during the transfer but made no complaint. Once she was secured, Marcus tested the weight, adjusting the straps and balance. It was heavy, very heavy, but manageable if he paced himself. "Here we go," Marcus said, lifting the travois handles and beginning to walk. The motion was awkward at first, the travois dragging over the uneven ground, but gradually they found a rhythm. Slow, steady progress away from the battlefield, away from the war, towards something uncertain but chosen rather than imposed. They traveled through the night, Marcus following terrain maps he'd memorized during his years of service, avoiding known patrol routes and observation points. Elindra remained silent for the most part, conserving her strength, but occasionally she'd point out features in the landscape that Marcus hadn't noticed, subtle signs of vampire movement, or areas where the earth had been disturbed by old battles. Her warrior training, even diminished by injury, provided perspectives Marcus lacked. They rested during daylight hours, hiding in whatever shelter they could find. Collapsed buildings, dense vegetation, once even a partially flooded drainage tunnel that was miserable but effectively invisible to aerial observation. During these rest periods, Marcus would feed Elindra from his wrist, and each time the connection between them deepened. He began to recognize her presence in his thoughts even when she wasn't feeding, a subtle awareness that felt both invasive and comforting. "Is this normal?" Marcus asked during one rest period, after Elindra had finished feeding. "This connection. I can feel you sometimes even when you're not drinking." "It's a side effect of direct feeding," Elindra explained. "The bond strengthens with repetition. Eventually we'll be able to sense each other's emotions, perhaps even share surface thoughts. It's intimate in a way that most vampires reserve for mates or blood family. And yet here we are, an enemy soldier and a war bride, bonding like we're long-lost siblings," Marcus observed. "The war has made strange companions of us," Elindra agreed. "But perhaps that strangeness is what we both needed. A relationship untainted by expectation or duty. Something genuine." By the fifth night they'd covered nearly 30 miles. Both were exhausted, Marcus from the physical strain of pulling the travois, Elindra from the constant discomfort of travel and the slow, agonizing process of healing. But they were also close to the neutral zone, close to something resembling safety. Marcus could feel it in the changing character of the landscape, the subtle shift from war-torn ruins to more intact settlements. They encountered their first challenge just before dawn on the 6th day. A patrol, but neither human nor vampire. These were neutrals, armed civilians guarding the approaches to their territory, suspicious of anyone approaching from the war zones. Marcus stopped well short of their position, raising his hands to show he was unarmed, a technical lie, but his weapons were holstered, and waited for them to approach. 3 guards moved forward cautiously, their weapons an eclectic mix of military hardware and improvised firearms. The leader, a scarred woman with steel-gray hair, looked from Marcus to Elindra and back again with an expression of profound skepticism. "That's a war bride," the woman said flatly. "And you're Republican military unless I miss my guess. What in the name of sanity are you two doing approaching neutral territory together?" "Defecting," Marcus said simply. "Both of us. She's injured, I'm helping her. We're looking for sanctuary, not trouble." "Defectors bring trouble whether they're looking for it or not," the woman replied. "Both sides send retrieval teams for deserters, especially high-value ones like war brides. You're asking us to harbor targets. We're asking for a chance," Elindra spoke up, her voice weak but clear. "A chance to be something other than soldiers, other than enemies. We're willing to work, to contribute, to earn our place. But we need time to heal, to recover. After that," she trailed off, clearly uncertain what came after. The gray-haired woman studied them both for a long moment. "You realize how insane this sounds? A human soldier and a vampire warrior, deserting together, bonded enough that you're pulling her on a travois through hostile territory." "We're extremely aware," Marcus said. "But here we are anyway." The woman sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "My name's Sarah. I run one of the settlements in the interior. We have rules in the neutral zone. No warfare, no revenge killings, no bringing external conflicts into our territory. You break those rules, we exile you back into the war zone, injured or not." "Understood." "Understood," Marcus and Elindra said in unison. Then follow me, Sarah said. And try not to die on the way. I hate filing paperwork for corpses. The settlement was larger than Marcus had expected, a sprawling collection of structures built from salvaged materials, housing perhaps 200 people. It occupied a valley that provided natural defenses while remaining accessible enough to facilitate the trade that sustained it. As Sarah led them through the outskirts, Marcus saw humans, vampires, and even a few individuals whose heritage seemed mixed or indeterminate, all coexisting with a pragmatic tolerance born from shared hardship. They were taken to what Sarah called the recovery house, a structure dedicated to treating refugees who arrived injured or ill. A healer, an older vampire with kind eyes and hands scarred from centuries of practice, examined Elindra thoroughly, asking technical questions about her injuries and treatment. Marcus explained about the feeding, the care he'd provided, and his concerns about the spinal damage. You did well, the healer said approvingly. Better than well, actually. You kept her alive when most field medics would have written her off. The spinal damage is severe, but it's healing, slowly but healing. With proper care, continued feeding, and time, she should regain mobility. Months rather than weeks, but recovery is possible. The relief Marcus felt was almost overwhelming. He hadn't realized how much he'd feared that his efforts would ultimately prove futile, that Elindra would remain paralyzed despite everything. Thank you, he said simply. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Elindra remained in the recovery house, undergoing treatments that combined vampiric blood magic with more conventional medical techniques. Marcus stayed nearby, helping with whatever work the settlement needed, construction, guard duty, teaching combat skills to the settlement's militia. He visited Elindra daily, providing blood when she needed it, talking for hours about everything and nothing. The bond between them deepened beyond the supernatural connection of feeding. They became friends, then confidants, sharing thoughts and fears they'd never voiced to anyone else. Elindra spoke about her guilt over the humans she'd killed, the civilizations she'd helped destroy, the weight of being a weapon when she'd wanted to be a scholar. Marcus talked about his lost brother, his shattered dreams of teaching, his growing conviction that the war was fundamentally meaningless, sustained only by institutions that benefited from endless conflict. Do you ever regret it? Elindra asked one evening as sunset painted the recovery house in shades of amber. Saving me. Deserting. Everything you gave up. Marcus considered the question seriously. I regret the pain it caused people who cared about me. If I had friends in my unit who worried, if I had family who'll never know what happened to me, those regrets are real. But do I regret saving you? Choosing to step away from the war? No. This feels more right than anything I've done in 15 years. Even though we're fugitives? Even though we can never go back. Especially because of that, Marcus said. We're free in a way we never were before. Free to choose, to define ourselves by something other than our function in a war machine. That's worth more than I can articulate. Elindra was quiet for a moment. When I regain mobility, if I regain mobility, I don't know what I'll do. I was trained for war, defined by it. Without that purpose, I'm not sure who I am. Then we'll figure it out together, Marcus replied. Reinvention is hard, but I suspect it's easier with company. Progress came in increments. After 6 weeks, Elindra could wiggle her toes. After 2 months, she could shift her legs slightly. After 3 months, she took her first halting steps with Marcus supporting her weight, tears streaming down her face not from pain but from relief and joy. The settlement celebrated her recovery with a quiet gathering, these people who'd learned to cherish small victories in a world defined by large tragedies. As Elindra healed physically, both she and Marcus healed in other ways. They found purpose in helping other refugees who arrived at the settlement, offering their respective expertise to people fleeing the war. Marcus taught literacy to children who'd grown up in war zones without access to education. Elindra worked with the settlement scholars, finally able to pursue the intellectual interests that her warrior life had suppressed. They built something together, not a romantic relationship precisely, though there was deep affection between them, but a partnership that transcended simple categorization. The world beyond the settlement continued its violence. Reports filtered in of major battles, territory changing hands, new weapons being deployed. Both sides sought defectors aggressively, and there were occasional incidents where retrieval teams approached the neutral zone's borders before being warned off by the settlement's collective defenses. But inside the valley, life continued with a stubborn normalcy. People worked, learned, loved, argued, celebrated, mourned. Life without war, or at least life at war's margins. A year after their arrival, Elindra was walking unaided, her wings healed enough to allow short flights, her body restored if not to its former war bride capabilities, then to something more sustainable and less destructive. She'd written several scholarly papers on vampire philosophy and human-vampire relations that circulated through the neutral zone's informal academic networks. Marcus had established a small school teaching history and literature to students of both species, working to combat the propaganda that sustained the war. They sat together one evening on the valley's ridge, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The view stretched for miles, encompassing both the peaceful settlement and in the far distance, the smoke-stained horizon that marked the war's continuing presence. "Do you think it will ever end?" Elindra asked quietly. "The war. Eventually," Marcus said. "All wars end one way or another. But I don't know if we'll see it. 3 centuries of conflict doesn't resolve quickly. Then what do? Sit here in our neutral valley and pretend the world isn't burning?" Marcus shook his head. "No. We do what we're doing, we provide an alternative. We prove that coexistence is possible, that vampires and humans can create something together rather than just destroy each other. Maybe that doesn't end the war tomorrow, but it plants seeds. And sometimes seeds are all you can manage." "Seeds," Elindra repeated, tasting the word. "I like that. The hope of eventual growth even if you never see the tree." "Exactly." Marcus reached out, taking her hand. The gesture was casual now, comfortable. A year of bonding and shared experience had made physical contact natural rather than fraught. "We were both weapons once, shaped by our respective societies to kill and destroy. But we chose to become something else. Gardeners maybe. Tending possibilities instead of certainties." Elindra smiled, squeezing his hand. "Gardeners. That's wonderfully pretentious and also kind of perfect." They sat in companionable silence as the sun completed its descent, twilight spreading across the valley like a gentle shroud. In the settlement below, lights began to flicker on, lanterns and fires that marked the presence of life persisting despite the war's best efforts to extinguish it. Marcus thought about the path that had led him here, from that ash-covered battlefield where he'd made a choice that defied logic. At the time, it had seemed like an impulse, a moment of irrational mercy. But looking back, he recognized it as something more. A refusal to let the war define him completely, a rebellion against the idea that enemies could be nothing but enemies. "Thank you," Elindra said suddenly. "I don't think I've ever said that properly. Thank you for not leaving me. For seeing a person instead of a target. For giving me the chance to become something other than what I was made to be." "Thank you for trusting me," Marcus replied. "For taking the risk of believing that an enemy could be something else. For sharing your thoughts and fears and making me remember what it means to connect with someone as a person rather than just a fellow soldier." "We're insufferably sentimental," Elindra observed. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But I'll take sentimental over numb any day." More people began arriving at the settlement as word spread through underground networks about the neutral zone's existence. Soldiers from both sides, civilians fleeing war-torn regions, families seeking any refuge from the endless conflict. Each arrival brought stories of loss and survival, and Marcus and Elindra found themselves becoming informal counselors, helping newcomers navigate the psychological transition from war to peace, from seeing the other side as monsters to recognizing them as people. One arrival, 6 months into their second year, brought unexpected complications. A young vampire named Theron appeared at the settlement's borders, wounded and pursued. He'd been part of a Dominion intelligence unit that had uncovered evidence of war crimes committed by high-ranking vampire nobility, including Elindra's own house. When he tried to report these findings, his superiors had attempted to silence him permanently. He'd fled, carrying documents that could potentially destabilize the Dominion's leadership if made public. "They'll send assassins," Theron warned during his debriefing with Sarah and the Settlement Council. "Not just for me but for anyone who helps me." I should keep moving, not endanger you. You'll die alone out there, Sarah replied pragmatically. And those documents you're carrying, they represent accountability, truth. Those are worth protecting. We'll handle the assassins if they come. Elindra volunteered immediately to help protect Theron, despite the personal cost. House Vorsaith is implicated in those documents, she told Marcus privately. My family. My mother might be directly responsible for some of what he uncovered. If the truth comes out, it could destroy everything they've built. Does that bother you? Marcus asked carefully. It should, Elindra admitted. Family loyalty, house honor, those were drilled into me from childhood. But all I feel is relief, actually, that someone is finally documenting the truth. That the crimes won't remain hidden behind military necessity and noble privilege. If that means my family falls, then perhaps they deserve to fall. The assassins came 3 weeks later, a strike team of 4 elite vampire warriors, moving with the lethal efficiency that made their kind so feared. But they'd underestimated the settlement's defenses and the determination of people who'd chosen peace but remembered how to wage war when necessary. The battle was brief and vicious, fought in darkness with both sides utilizing every advantage their respective natures provided. Marcus fought alongside Elindra, their bond allowing them to coordinate with almost telepathic precision. He'd never imagined, back on that ash-covered battlefield, that he and the paralyzed war bride would someday fight together against her own people. But here they were, protecting a settlement that had become home, defending ideals of truth and accountability that transcended old loyalties. 2 assassins died in the fighting. The other 2 withdrew when it became clear their mission would fail at unacceptable cost. In the aftermath, as the settlement tended wounded and assessed damage, Marcus found Elindra standing at the valley's edge, staring toward the distant horizon where the Dominion's territories lay. You're thinking about them, Marcus said, joining her. Your family. My sister, Elindra corrected quietly. She's still there, still part of that system. When the documents Theron carried become public, the fallout will be catastrophic for House Vorsaith. She might be caught in that collapse, punished for association even if she had nothing to do with the crimes. Do you want to try to reach her? Warn her? Elindra was silent for a long time. I don't know. Part of me says yes, that blood loyalty demands I try to protect her. But another part recognizes that protecting her might mean perpetuating the system that's caused so much harm. And I don't know if I can do that anymore, even for someone I love. It's not an easy answer, Marcus acknowledged. But you don't have to decide alone. Whatever you choose, I'll support it. We'll figure it out together. Elindra turned to look at him, and there was gratitude in her red eyes but also something deeper, a recognition of partnership that had become foundational to both their lives. Together. I think that's the word that's defined everything since you pulled me onto that travois. We face things together, human and vampire, former enemies who became something we don't have adequate language to describe. Maybe that's the point, Marcus suggested. Maybe new relationships require new words. We're not just allies or friends or comrades. We're something the war never accounted for, something that exists outside its categorizations. Gardeners? Elindra said with a slight smile. Tending possibilities. They stood together as twilight deepened, 2 figures silhouetted against the dying light. A human soldier who'd chosen mercy over military necessity, and a vampire war bride who'd chosen truth over duty. The settlement behind them continued its evening routines, people of both species coexisting with an ease that would have seemed impossible on the battlefield where their story had begun. The war still raged beyond the valley's protective borders, still consumed lives and resources in its grinding mathematics of destruction. But here, in this small refuge, something different had taken root. The publication of Theron's documents sent shockwaves through both the Dominion and the Republican territories. Detailed accounts of war crimes, corruption, and the cynical manipulation of the conflict by powerful interests on both sides couldn't be suppressed or dismissed. The documents spread through unofficial channels, smuggled across borders, copied and distributed by networks of disillusioned soldiers, scholars, and civilians who'd grown tired of the war's endless consumption. House Vorsaith collapsed within 6 months. Elindra's mother was executed by the Dominion's High Council for crimes that could no longer be concealed, her father stripped of rank and exiled. But Elindra's sister, Sarai, had seen the collapse coming. She'd fled before the worst of the fallout, making a dangerous journey across contested territory to reach the neutral zones, guided by contacts who knew of Elindra's sanctuary. The reunion between the sisters was emotional and complicated. Sarai was appalled by the revelations about their parents but also hurt by Elindra's perceived abandonment. Elindra struggled with guilt over not warning Sarai earlier and with anger over the lies that had defined their childhood. Marcus observed their fraught interactions with empathy, recognizing in their relationship dynamics the same tensions that had defined his own path: the gap between institutional loyalty and personal morality, the pain of discovering that authorities you trusted were corrupt. "Give it time," he told Elindra after a particularly difficult conversation with Sarai. "She's processing trauma and betrayal. You did the same thing when you first arrived. Eventually she'll find her footing. And if she doesn't? If she decides she hates me for destroying our family? Then you'll have made a choice that aligned with your values, even if it cost you personally," Marcus said. "That's not comfortable, but it's honest. And honesty matters more in the long run." Gradually, Sarai did find her footing. She began working with the settlement scholars, her academic training proving valuable as the neutral zones worked to document and preserve truth about the war's conduct. She and Elindra rebuilt their relationship slowly, finding new ground as equals rather than as elder and younger sister trapped in hierarchical family dynamics. The war itself began changing in ways that reflected the document's impact. Morale problems plagued both sides as soldiers questioned whether they were truly fighting for noble causes or merely serving corrupt leadership. Desertion rates increased dramatically, with more refugees flowing into the neutral zones than ever before. Some military units refused orders outright, and there were even instances of human and vampire forces negotiating local ceasefires rather than engaging in pointless battles. Marcus and Elindra found themselves at the center of a growing movement, not leading it exactly but serving as symbols of what was possible. Their story had spread through informal networks: the human soldier who'd saved a paralyzed enemy, the war bride who'd chosen truth over duty, the partnership they'd built that challenged fundamental assumptions about the war's necessity. People arrived at the settlement specifically to meet them, to understand how such a bond could form across species lines, to learn if peace was genuinely possible or merely idealistic fantasy. "We never set out to be symbols," Elindra said during one particularly exhausting day of meeting with delegations from various neutral settlements and even some representatives from reform factions within both major powers. "Most symbols don't," Marcus replied. "They just make choices that resonate with what others are feeling but haven't articulated yet. We chose each other over the war." Apparently, a lot of people were waiting for permission to make similar choices. The transformation from individual sanctuary to broader movement wasn't without challenges. Hardliners on both sides denounced the neutral zones as treasonous, and there were periodic attempts to disrupt or destroy the settlements. Resources remained scarce, and conflicts arose between residents who'd brought old grudges with them. But slowly, persistently, the settlements grew and stabilized, becoming recognized features of the political landscape rather than temporary aberrations. 3 years after Marcus had carried Elindra away from that ash-covered battlefield, formal peace negotiations began between the Dominion and the Republican alliance. The talks were tentative, frequently stalled, and burdened by 3 centuries of accumulated hatred. But they were happening, unprecedented, fragile but real. Representatives from the neutral zones were invited to participate as mediators, and Marcus and Elindra found themselves sitting in conference rooms alongside military commanders and political leaders, offering perspectives that neither side had previously considered. "You're asking us to forgive atrocities," a Republican general said during one particularly heated session. "To negotiate with vampires who've slaughtered entire cities. We're asking you to recognize that continued war serves no one's interests except those who profit from it," Elindra replied calmly. "I've killed humans. Many humans. I was trained to do it efficiently and without hesitation. But I've also lived among humans, learned from them, built relationships with them. The narrative that we're incompatible species doomed to eternal conflict is propaganda, not truth." "Easy to say from the safety of your neutral valley," the general shot back. "I was left to die on a battlefield by my own people, Elindra said, her voice hardening. I spent months paralyzed, dependent on the mercy of an enemy soldier who had every reason to kill me or let me die. I've earned my perspective through suffering, General, not through philosophical abstraction. The question isn't whether peace is hard. Of course it's hard. The question is whether continued war is sustainable, and I think we all know it's not. The negotiations continued through multiple rounds, with setbacks and breakthroughs occurring in equal measure. Marcus and Elindra returned to their settlement between sessions, finding grounding in the community they'd helped build. They taught classes, mediated disputes, helped new arrivals adjust, and maintained the routines that had become their life. The work was never finished, never perfect, but it was meaningful in ways that war had never been. Do you think they'll actually achieve peace? Sarai asked one evening as the three of them, Elindra, Marcus and Sarai, shared a meal in the small home Marcus and Elindra had built on the settlement's outskirts. I think they'll achieve a ceasefire, Marcus said carefully. True peace will take generations, time for wounds to heal, for new generations to grow up without war as their defining reality. But a ceasefire is where it has to start. An agreement to stop killing each other long enough to imagine alternatives. And what happens to places like this? Sarai gestured to indicate the settlement. If peace comes, do the neutral zones become obsolete? I don't think so, Elindra said thoughtfully. We've built something here that goes beyond just avoiding war. We've created communities that genuinely integrate species, that value truth and accountability, that support people in defining themselves outside traditional power structures. That model might become more important, not less, as both societies work to transition from war to peace. The ceasefire was declared on a cold morning in early spring, exactly 4 years after Marcus had carried Elindra away from the Battle of Thornwick Junction. The announcement came via radio broadcast simultaneously in both Dominion and Republican territories. Effective immediately, all offensive military operations would cease, prisoners would be exchanged, and formal peace negotiations would continue with the goal of establishing permanent treaties. The war wasn't over. Treaties could collapse, hostilities could resume, but for the first time in 3 centuries, there was legitimate hope that peace might be possible. The celebration in the settlement was subdued but genuine. These were people who'd lived through too much to fully trust good news, but who also desperately wanted to believe that change was possible. Marcus and Elindra stood together in the central square as the announcement played, surrounded by people whose lives they'd touched and who'd touched theirs in turn. We did it, Elindra said softly, almost disbelievingly. A ceasefire. An actual ceasefire. We contributed, Marcus corrected gently. Theron did it by bringing truth to light. Sarai and the other scholars did it by documenting and spreading that truth. Every soldier who deserted, every civilian who demanded accountability, every person who chose peace over revenge, they did it. We just happened to be visible parts of a much larger movement. Take the win, Marcus, Elindra said with a smile. You're allowed to feel proud of what we accomplished. I am proud, Marcus admitted. Not just of the ceasefire but of this. He gestured to encompass the settlement, the people around them, the life they'd built. We proved something important. That enemies can become partners, that species lines don't determine destiny, that individuals can choose to step away from systems that demand their participation. That's worth more than any single military victory. As the celebrations continued around them, Marcus thought back to that night on the battlefield, when he'd made a choice that defied logic and training. He'd had no idea where that choice would lead, couldn't have imagined standing here years later, part of a community that shouldn't exist, watching the first fragile steps toward peace after centuries of war. It had started with a single act of mercy toward a paralyzed enemy who'd asked him to make her death quick. He'd refused, choosing instead to make her life possible, and from that refusal, everything else had grown. What now? Elindra asked, echoing her question from years earlier but with entirely different context. We've spent years working toward peace. What do we do if we actually get it? Marcus considered the question seriously. We keep gardening. Keep tending possibilities. Help people navigate the transition from war to whatever comes next. There will be challenges, resentment, trauma, people who don't want peace or don't believe in it. The work doesn't end with a ceasefire. No rest for the weary? Rest is overrated, Marcus replied with a slight smile. Besides, I seem to recall someone once telling me she was terrible company when healing. Now that you're healed, I'm curious to see what you're like when you're actually comfortable. Elindra laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. Insufferable, probably. Fair warning. I've survived 15 years of war, 4 years of peace-building, and countless hours of your philosophical debates, Marcus said. I think I can handle insufferable. They stood together as twilight descended once again, painting the valley in familiar shades of ember and shadow. The war had shaped them both, hollowed them out and filled them with pain and purpose in equal measure. But they'd chosen to step away from that shaping, to become something other than what the war demanded. In doing so, they'd created ripples that had grown into waves, changing not just their own lives but potentially the trajectory of an entire conflict. The paralyzed war bride who'd been left to die had survived and healed, becoming a scholar and peace advocate. The human soldier who'd stepped in to help her had found purpose beyond survival, becoming a teacher and bridge builder. Together they'd proved that choices mattered, that individuals could challenge systems, that mercy could be more strategic than violence. Their story had become legend in the neutral zones and beyond, whispered about in military barracks and scholarly halls, cited in arguments for peace, held up as evidence that alternatives existed. But for Marcus and Elindra themselves, the legend was less important than the daily reality, the work of building community, supporting healing, teaching new generations, and simply being present for each other through victories and setbacks alike. They'd found in each other what the war had tried to deny them: connection, purpose, hope, and the freedom to define themselves by their choices rather than their designated roles. As night fully claimed the valley, lights flickered on throughout the settlement, hundreds of small flames representing lives that had chosen peace over war, truth over propaganda, possibility over resignation. Marcus and Elindra returned to their home, this structure they'd built with their own hands, and prepared for whatever tomorrow would bring. The ceasefire would hold or it wouldn't. The peace negotiations would succeed or fail. But regardless of those outcomes, they'd already won something more fundamental: the right to be people instead of weapons, partners instead of enemies, gardeners tending possibilities in a world that had tried to convince them only destruction was possible. The ash had stopped falling years ago, but the memory of that battlefield remained, not as trauma exactly but as origin point, the place where everything changed because one exhausted soldier had chosen mercy over expediency, and one abandoned warrior had accepted help from an unexpected source. From that single choice, on a twilight field covered in the debris of war, an entire future had grown. And as Marcus and Elindra settled into the evening, surrounded by the community that choice had enabled, they understood with quiet certainty that the story wasn't ending. It was just beginning.